On Binkov's battlegrounds, we often analyze and compare military weapons and equipment of various armed forces. But even with the most sophisticated military hardware, one man in the right place at the right time can change the course of a battle. Lieutenant Zvi Greengold, also known as Zvika, is one such man. A tank commander in the Israeli Defense Forces. Fighting in one tank, he held off the progress of an entire enemy brigade. He did it by adapting clever hit-and-run tactics and by simply refusing to back down. His actions during the Yom Kippur War not only helped turn the tide of battle for Golan Heights, but might have even changed the course of the entire war. So, how did that happen? Armored formations and the Air Force can turn the tide of a war. Try it yourself in Warpath, a game sponsoring this video. Warpath combines the World War II setting with real-time strategy gameplay. Ever wondered how you'd fare as a commander landing on Normandy or defending Moscow? Now you can try it out. Warpath models historical tanks, guns, planes and other toys. The game's newest update focuses on the Air Force. There are 42 new fighters and bombers to collect and modify. The three-dimensional battlefield offers various strategies, but I'd say it's crucial to achieve that synergy of your bombers above and your tanks mowing down the enemies below. You can command units freely in Warpath, decide on routes and times of attack. The new update offers horizontal screenplay and vast city construction options. The game is completely free, available on Google Play and App Store. And I'll bet you didn't expect this. Jean-Claude Van Damme arrives to Warpath with generous rewards. Find him in-game to unlock your commanders and aircraft. Click on the link in the description to download the game. Use my code and you will get a gift pack of gold, oil, steel and army experience worth $10. Use those resources to kickstart yourself in the upcoming battles. The Yom Kippur War began on October 6, 1973, when a coalition of countries led by Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel. To the south, Egyptian forces established a foothold on the eastern side of the Suez Canal. They intended to compel the Israelis to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. Simultaneously, Syria launched an offensive in the north, planning to recapture the strategically critical area of Golan Heights. Syrian offensive consisted of 1,400 tanks and 1,000 artillery pieces, accompanied by the supporting air power. By comparison, Israeli Defense Forces had only 2 tank brigades in the area, the 188th Barak Armored Brigade with roughly 60 Israeli Centurions and Shermans, and 7th Armored Brigade with 110 tanks. How was this monumental mismatch of forces possible? There are several reasons for this. First, the coalition deliberately launched the attack on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism, during which people pray and fast from dawn to dusk. During Yom Kippur, Israeli forces typically underwent large-scale demobilization. Furthermore, by the time the offensive began, the Syrian army had been fully mobilized for months. This meant their attack lacked early warning signs. In addition, while Israeli leaders were acutely aware of Syrian activity, they didn't want to escalate tensions further. They believed, probably correctly, that Syrians would perceive any amassing of the IDF troops at the border as a preparation for a preemptive strike. Finally, Israeli intelligence wrongly assumed that any Syrian attack could be contained by the forces in the Golan Heights long enough for Israel to mobilize its reserves. Syrian plan was to break through Israeli lines using mechanized divisions supported by 900 tanks. Then additional 500 tanks would move in to retake the Golan Heights. Their forces split into 2 prongs. While the northern one was contained by the IDF defense, the southern one managed to break through. 2 Syrian infantry divisions, accompanied by over 400 tanks, attacked 2 Israeli brigades, which had 170 tanks between them. Vastly outnumbered, Israelis could merely try to slow down the enemy attack while awaiting reinforcements. And that brings us to Zvika Greengold. When the Yom Kippur War broke out, then 21-year-old Lieutenant Zvi Greengold was on leave. When he saw combat jets flying and heard the air raid sirens, he realized Israel was under attack. At the time, Greengold was stationed at the army base in Nafak as a tank officer. so he hitched a ride to the base only to learn there was almost no military equipment available. There were 2 slightly damaged British-made Centurion tanks. He radioed the command requesting permission to engage the enemy with his so-called tank force. Greengold then assembled skeleton crews from soldiers in the base, repaired the vehicles, and loaded the ammunition. He took command of the more damaged tank, giving company commander Hagai Tzur the better one. Around 9 p.m., Israeli forces in the area heard the radio report about Zvika force being on the way. Nobody knew it consisted of just 2 damaged tanks. The Zvika force headed into the night towards the Syrian border, along the so-called petroleum road. After several hours of slow driving, Greengold and Tzur encountered their first enemy tank, possibly part of Syrian forward recon. Following their training, the Israelis promptly drove their Centurion tanks into hull-down positions, shifting their 105mm guns towards the Syrian T-55. Greengold's gunner destroyed it, but their radio unit was damaged during the fight, cutting them off from others. Greengold decided to switch the tanks with Hagai Tzur and told him to follow his lead. However, in the dark and without radio contact, the second tank couldn't keep up. Soon enough, Greengold and his crew were utterly alone. There are several things here we should keep in mind. First, just like many other tankmen in Israeli defense forces, Zvika Greengold was well trained. Both the soldiers and the command were keenly aware Israeli tanks would probably be outnumbered in any battle. Because of that, their training stressed the importance of speed and precision of attacks. Gunnery training of Israeli tank crews was better than of their Syrian counterparts. Their goal was to destroy enemy tanks in a single shot, whenever possible. In addition, Greengold already had some experience in combat since he participated in raids in Syria and Lebanon. Secondly, Israeli forces were not only vastly outnumbered, but somewhat outmatched as well. Syrian tanks utilized sophisticated Soviet night vision equipment that gave them a distinct advantage against Israelis, who had none on their tanks. Israeli Centurions had a big and powerful gun, but it was still not assured it could punch through T-62's armor. It did offer a much faster firing rate, though. Centurion was well armored against the T-55s, but not necessarily so against the more powerful gun on the T-62s. Luckily, most Syrian tanks were indeed T-55s and not the more powerful T-62s. Finally, Israeli tanks couldn't rely on their air force's air support. Syrian command knew the IDF utilized its combat jets like A-4 Skyhawks and F-4 Phantoms to help ground troops negate the enemy's superior numbers. But the night attack meant Israel could not find any ground targets. Syrians also used Soviet-made anti-aircraft systems to thin out the Israeli jets, leaving their armored units mostly on their own. Even though he was isolated and separated, Greengold had an easier time spotting a moving enemy and attacked a column of Syrian tanks. Allegedly, with just 3 shots, he hit 3 Syrian T-55s. He then shifted the position of his vehicle and within minutes hit another 3 tanks. Soon afterwards, Greengold spotted the lights of an incoming Syrian unit advancing through the highlands. It was the 452nd Tank Battalion under Major Ismail. Greengold reported this to his superiors by radio. His superior officer, Colonel Yitzhak Ben Shaham of the 188th Brigade, was at the time convinced the Zvika force was considerably more powerful than it was. The command wanted to know how many enemy vehicles there were compared to the strength of the Zvika force. However, Greengold couldn't tell them that. He was aware Syrians were most likely intercepting Israeli radio communication. They were using Israeli radio chatter to locate their units and strike at them with artillery fire. Because of this, Greengold had to be vague and keep communication down to a minimum. While the Syrian column advanced with their lights turned on, Greengold waited in the dark until the first enemy tank was a mere 20 meters away before firing. By deliberately attacking the first vehicle, he forced the entire column to halt its progress. For the next hour or so, his lone Centurion tank harried the immobilized Syrians. Greengold ordered his driver to use the terrain to their advantage. The tank would fire its gun, then drive behind a mount to prevent exposure. It would attack, retreat into darkness, shift location, and then attack again. At one point, Greengold's tank was driving backwards along the flank of the Syrian column, firing at close range while dodging enemy shells. Hoping to target their attacker easier, Syrians turned on their tank's searchlights. Instead, this only made them more vulnerable. All this maneuvering paid off. Not only did Greengold and his crew destroy some 10 enemy tanks, but they also convinced Syrians they were ambushed by an entire tank company. The commander ordered forces to temporarily halt their advance and deal with the Israelis in the morning. This gave the IDF additional time to bring their reserves to the front and try to stop the Syrian offensive. Meanwhile, Greengold's tank withdrew into darkness and disappeared. By this time it was around midnight, and Greengold's superior officers were acutely aware of the massive scale of an attack towards their base in Nafak. In response, they ordered the Zvika force to join Lieutenant Colonel Uzi Moore and his reserves, around 8 tanks. Their objective was to help relieve the brigade headquarters at Nafak. They joined forces around 2 a.m., but their luck soon ran out. In the darkness, their unit encountered a large Syrian tank force, equipped with Soviet-made T-62s. These not only had night vision equipment, but were superior to older T-55s, with slightly better armor, but also a better gun stabilization and a more powerful 115mm smoothbore gun. First Israeli Centurion was promptly hit and caught fire. As Greengold ordered another tank to help him rescue the crew of the stricken vehicle, his tank was hit as well. Greengold and his gunner escaped with their uniforms on fire, suffering burns. Their driver was killed while Lieutenant Colonel Moore was severely wounded. Greengold momentarily lost consciousness, but then managed to take control of the nearest undamaged Centurion. He relocated as Colonel Ben Shaham ordered him by radio to hold the position on the Petroleum Road. 2 other tanks took the wounded back to the base. At dawn, Zvika force once again received reinforcements. A hastily assembled reserve force led by Colonel David Israeli, deputy commander of the 188th Brigade. 14 Israeli tanks were facing an entire Syrian armored brigade, consisting of approximately 100 tanks and 40 armored personnel carriers. The battle began at a distance of 1400 meters. Centurion's gun precision and IDF training gave some advantage to the Israelis in such long-range engagements. Syrians used Soviet-made Sagar-guided missiles that Greengold had some previous experience with. Using radio, he began issuing instructions to other tank commanders on how best to avoid getting hit. But this was merely a feint. While Syrian tanks battled the Zvika force, more Syrian units went around them. Their objective was to attack the nearby crossroads at Nafak and the base Greengold left from last evening. Their plan almost succeeded. 2 Syrian tank companies reached the base in Nafak, where there were no armored vehicles to stop them. At one point, officers began issuing weapons to office staff. The only other forces left were 2 trackless Centurions and several soldiers with anti-tank missile launchers. In response, the remains of the Zvika force withdrew to help defend Nafak. 1 Syrian T-55 crashed into the headquarters building, only to be destroyed by Greengold's tank. The command sent out scouts and learned there was a single tank in the base fighting Syrians. Greengold's actions weren't in vain. He and other defenders bought the IDF just enough time to bring in some of the reserves. When Syrians found themselves suddenly attacked from several directions at once, they assumed they fell into an ambush and began retreating. According to Greengold himself, this is what decided the battle for the Golan Heights. It was around this point that Zvika Greengold finally broke down. After spending over 24 hours in combat, during which he changed his tanks several times, he was burned, wounded and tired. During a lull in the fighting, Greengold climbed out of his tank saying, "I can't go on anymore." He was instantly taken to medical care. As Greengold later explained in an interview, at that moment he felt as if the Israeli army had reached the end of the road. Zvika felt alone, with just 1 tank to stop the enemy invasion. But that's all it took. While Zvika's story is exceptional, he wasn't the only hero that day. In those first 24 hours of the Yom Kippur War, groups of Israeli tanks desperately attacked superior enemy forces, hoping to halt their advance. Major Baruch Lenchner led a tank unit against Syrian forces, remaining in battle even when he was the only one left. The aforementioned Lieutenant Colonel Israeli and Colonel Ben Shoham of the 188th Brigade destroyed some 20 enemy tanks between them. When the Israeli Centurion ran out of ammunition, it deliberately rammed the enemy T-62, attacking Ben Shoham's tank. All these officers were killed in combat. The battle raged for several days. Both sides knew time was working against them. Syrians fought to retake the Golan Heights before Israelis sent in even more reinforcements. Israelis struggled to hold them off. Syrians obliterated the 188th Brigade. The 7th Brigade was down to 6 tanks. Then, as Israelis began reinforcing their defenses, the Syrian offensive broke down and stopped. They fought non-stop for 3 days straight. The Syrians didn't realize how close they were to victory. Before long, the IDF stabilized the front. By October 11th, the Israelis not only pushed the Syrians back, but launched a counteroffensive into Syria. On October 23rd, the United Nations sanctioned ceasefire came into effect. Lieutenant Zvi Greengold was awarded the Medal of Valor, the highest military decoration in Israel. Beside him, only 7 other people received it for their acts during the Yom Kippur War. Some sources claimed Greengold took out 40 or even 60 enemy tanks. Greengold himself estimates he hit and neutralized around 20 armored vehicles. Despite the final number of actually destroyed tanks, which may never be precisely known, he single-handedly helped to turn the tide of war, demonstrating that the right person in the right place at the right time can change the course of a battle. Nevertheless, even though Israel won the Yom Kippur War, Israeli victory was a bitter one. Between 2,500 and 2,800 soldiers died. Somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 soldiers were wounded. The IDF lost approximately 1,000 tanks and at least 100 airplanes. And yet, if it wasn't for soldiers like Zvika Greengold, the war could have ended much worse for Israel. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.